The champagne flutes gleamed under the crystal chandelier as I carefully arranged them on the silver tray. Through the archway, I could hear my husband Richard's booming laugh echoing through our penthouse living room, mingling with the voices of his guests. Our guests, technically, though he'd made it abundantly clear I wasn't to join them as an equal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Darling, he'd said that morning, his tone dripping with condescension, I need you to play hostess tonight. Keep the drinks flowing, pass the hors d'oeuvres. Make yourself useful for once. I'd simply nodded, the same way I'd been nodding for the past 3 years of our marriage. The same way I'd nodded when he suggested I take a break from my career. The same way I'd nodded when he started introducing me to his friends as my wife, she stays home, with that particular emphasis that made it sound like a character flaw. If only he knew. Before we begin this journey together, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for being part of this incredible community. If you're enjoying these stories of empowerment and justice, consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps us continue sharing these remarkable tales. Now, let's dive into tonight's unfolding drama. The tray felt solid in my hands as I pushed through the swinging door into the living room. 6 men in expensive suits sprawled across my Italian leather furniture, their ties loosened, their voices growing louder with each round of drinks. These were Richard's important clients from Morrison & Associates, a mid-tier law firm that handled corporate mergers. What Richard didn't know, what nobody in this room except me knew, was that Morrison & Associates was a feeder firm. They handled the preliminary work, the small to medium cases, and when something truly significant came along, they referred it upward to the prestigious firms that actually wielded power in this city. Firms like Hartley, Chen and Bradford. My firm. "Ah, here she is," Richard announced as I entered, his voice taking on that performative quality he used when he wanted to impress. "Gentlemen, let me introduce you to Maria. She keeps our home running smoothly." Maria. Not Rebecca. Not his wife. Maria. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, that split second of shock that never quite went away no matter how many times he pulled this particular stunt. But I'd learned to control my expressions, to keep my face neutral, to play the part he'd assigned me. "Maria, these are very important clients," Richard continued, not even looking at me. "Mr. Patterson, Mr. Chen, Mr. Wolfe, Mr. Richardson, Mr. DeLuca, and Mr. Foster. They're working on the Stanton merger, very high-profile case." I knew all about the Stanton merger. My firm had been quietly approached about it 2 months ago. We'd declined, citing conflicts of interest. What we hadn't disclosed was that we were representing the other side, the company Stanton was trying to merge with. And we were about to blow Morrison & Associates' entire strategy out of the water. "Pleasure," I murmured, keeping my eyes downcast as I offered the tray. One by one, they took glasses, barely acknowledging me. All except one. Mr. Patterson. Late 40s, silver at his temples, sharp eyes that actually looked at me rather than through me. He took a glass but held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," he said, his tone different from the others. Curious. "How long have you worked for the Bradfords?" The irony of his question nearly made me laugh. Bradford. My maiden name. The name on the letterhead of the most powerful litigation firm in the state. But Richard had never bothered to ask about my family, never bothered to wonder why I'd been so financially secure when we met, never questioned the trust fund he thought supported my shopping habit. "A few years," I replied softly, playing my part. Richard, you're lucky to have such dedicated help, Patterson continued. Good staff is so hard to find these days. Staff. The word hung in the air like a slap. I was his wife, wearing his ring, living in a penthouse that my money had purchased, and his client thought I was the help. Richard beamed, clearly pleased. Oh, I don't know what I'd do without her. She keeps everything running smoothly. Makes life so much easier. I retreated to the kitchen, my hands trembling slightly as I set down the tray. The rage I'd been banking for months threatened to surface, but I forced it down. Not yet. Not tonight. Tonight was about gathering information, about watching them relax into their arrogance, about learning exactly what Morrison and Associates thought they were doing with the Stanton case. Through the crack in the door, I could hear them settling into their discussion. So, Richard, walk us through your strategy again, Mr. Wolf said. The board meeting is in 2 weeks, and we need to be certain about our approach. I pulled out my phone, activating the recording app. The penthouse had excellent acoustics. Every word came through crystal clear. It's simple, Richard began, and I could hear the smugness in his voice. Stanton's board doesn't know about the environmental violations at their Birmingham plant. We've kept that information sealed. Once the merger goes through, Morrison and Associates will be positioned as the firm of record for the combined entity. We're talking about a $10 million retainer, gentlemen. My finger hovered over the stop button. Environmental violations. Sealed information. This wasn't just aggressive litigation strategy. This was potentially criminal. What about Hartley, Chen, and Bradford? Patterson asked. I've heard rumors they might be involved somehow. The room fell silent for a moment. Even from the kitchen, I could feel the tension shift. Hartley, Chen, and Bradford, Richard scoffed. Those ivory tower elitists? Please. They wouldn't touch a case like this. Too dirty for their pristine reputation. Besides, I have it on good authority that they're completely unaware of this merger. I smiled in the darkness of the kitchen. Richard's good authority was wrong. Very wrong. Richard, I know you're confident, Patterson pressed, but HC&B has a reputation for a reason. If they're representing the other side, they're not. Richard cut him off. Trust me, I've made sure of it. How exactly had he made sure? I made a mental note to have our security team investigate what Richard had been doing with his days. If he'd been interfering with my firm's business, if he'd been using information he'd gleaned from our home. The conversation drifted to other matters, billing strategies, client management, the usual shop talk. I began preparing the next round of canapes, my mind working through the implications of what I'd just heard. 3 years ago, I'd met Richard at a legal conference. I'd been a junior partner then, already on the fast track, but still building my reputation. He'd been charming, attentive, seemingly awed by my success. We'd dated for 6 months before he proposed, and I'd been foolish enough to believe he loved me for who I was. The first red flag came 2 weeks after our wedding, when he suggested I might want to slow down my career. You're working too hard, he'd said. We can afford for you to take it easy. Focus on us. I'd been touched. How naive. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Within 6 months, he was making comments about my hours, my dedication to my clients, the late nights at the office. You're married now, he'd say. Isn't it time to reprioritize? But I knew what was really happening. Richard had married up, way up, and he couldn't handle it. Every case I won, every client I secured, Every mention in the legal journals reminded him that his wife was more successful than he would ever be. So he'd launched a systematic campaign to diminish me. Small comments at first. Did you really need to mention that case at dinner? Then larger ones. Maybe you should let the senior partners take the lead on this one. Eventually, he'd convinced me to move to advisory status at the firm, working from home, staying out of the spotlight. What he didn't know was that advisory status was a fiction I'd created. I was still the lead rainmaker at Hartley, Chen, and Bradford. I still closed the biggest deals. I still mentored the junior associates and made the strategic decisions that kept us at the top of the legal food chain. I just did it all under various pseudonyms and through carefully orchestrated proxies. My partners knew, of course. Margaret Hartley and David Chen had been my mentors since law school. They understood immediately when I'd explained the situation with Richard, had helped me construct an elaborate system that kept my involvement hidden from my husband. It's not sustainable, Margaret had warned me a year ago. Eventually, you'll have to choose your marriage or your truth. I'd thought I could manage both. I'd thought maybe Richard would change, mature, learn to accept my success. Tonight had proven how wrong I'd been. I emerged from the kitchen with fresh appetizers, once again playing the invisible server. The men had moved to the dining area, spreading documents across my antique mahogany table. Strategy memos, financial projections, legal briefs, all related to the Stanton merger. Maria, coffee. Richard snapped his fingers at me without looking up. I stood there for a moment, the silver tray in my hands, watching my husband snap his fingers at me like I was a dog. 3 years of marriage. 3 years of biting my tongue. 3 years of watching this man whom I'd loved diminish me, dismiss me, erase me. Of course, I said quietly, returning to the kitchen. As the espresso machine hummed, I scrolled through my phone, sending encrypted messages to Margaret and David. Tomorrow morning, we were meeting with the team representing Gemtech Industries, Stanton's proposed merger partner. What I'd overheard tonight changed everything. My phone buzzed. Margaret's response was immediate. Are you sure about this? Once we move forward, there's no going back. I thought about Richard out there, casually treating me like staff in my own home. I thought about the months of subtle psychological warfare, the constant undermining, the way he'd systematically tried to erase everything I'd worked for. I typed back. I've never been more sure about anything. The coffee tray ready, I returned to find the men deep in discussion. The key is timing, Mr. DeLuca was saying. If we can keep the environmental issues quiet for just 3 more weeks. Excuse me, Mr. DeLuca, Patterson interrupted. He was looking at me again, that same curious expression. Maria, was it? I nodded, setting down the coffee service. You know, he continued, you have remarkable poise. Have you ever considered working in a professional capacity? My wife runs a staffing agency for executive assistants. We're always looking for people with your presence. The room fell silent. Even Richard looked up surprised. That's very kind, I managed, unsure where this was going. No, I'm serious, Patterson continued. He pulled out a business card. Here, this is my personal number. I think you could do very well for yourself. Better than... He glanced around. Serving drinks. No offense intended. I took the card with trembling fingers. Patterson was offering me a job, in front of my husband, because he thought I was the maid. The humiliation should have been overwhelming. Instead, I felt something else entirely. Clarity. This was who Richard had made me in his world. This was how completely he'd erased my identity. That won't be necessary, Richard interjected, his voice tight. For the first time that evening, I detected something in his tone. Discomfort? Embarrassment? Why not? Patterson challenged. If she's just staff, surely you wouldn't mind her having other opportunities. The trap was beautiful. If Richard claimed me as his wife now, he'd look like a fool for the way he'd treated me all evening. If he didn't, he'd have to watch as his client recruited his help. Maria is very valuable to us, Richard said carefully. We'd prefer she remain focused on her current position. Us, not me, not she's my wife. Just us. Well, the offer stands, Patterson said, handing me the card. Good help is hard to find, but great help is worth investing in. I pocketed the card and retreated once more to the kitchen. My phone was buzzing with messages. The legal team had preliminary findings on Richard's activities. What they'd found made my blood run cold. For the past 6 months, Richard had been systematically passing information to Morrison and Associates about my firm's client list, our strategic approaches, our billing structures. Nothing overtly illegal, nothing that would trigger clear ethical violations, but enough to give his firm an edge in several key cases. He'd been using me, using our marriage, using the trust I'd stupidly given him to undermine my life's work. The rage I'd been suppressing all evening finally broke through. My hands shook as I gripped the marble counter. All those late-night strategy sessions he'd claimed to have, all those questions about my day, my cases, my clients, all those concerned questions about firm politics and partner disputes. He'd been mining me for information. I pulled up the encrypted files my security team had compiled, bank records showing deposits from Morrison and Associates, email chains discussing information received from reliable sources, meeting notes that quoted my exact words from conversations I'd had with Richard in the privacy of our home. Everything okay back here? I spun around. Patterson stood in the kitchen doorway, his expression concerned. Fine, I said quickly, wiping my eyes. Just tired. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Look, I don't know what your situation is, and it's none of my business. But I've been practicing law for 25 years, and I've developed an eye for people. You're not just staff. The way you carry yourself, the way you move through this space. This is your home. I stared at him, my heart pounding. Richard is my client, he continued, but that doesn't mean I'm blind. The way he treats you, it's not right. Whatever the truth is, you deserve better than this. Before I could respond, Richard's voice called out, Patterson, we need your input on the deposition schedule. Patterson held my gaze for another moment. That card I gave you? My wife's staffing agency is a cover. She actually runs an advocacy group for people in complicated situations. If you ever need help, real help, call that number. He left before I could process what he'd said. I stood alone in my kitchen, in my penthouse, in my life that Richard had systematically dismantled, holding a business card from a man who'd seen through the entire charade in the span of one evening. The party continued for another 2 hours. I played my part perfectly, serving drinks, clearing plates, remaining invisible. By the time the last guest departed, Richard was in high spirits. "Excellent evening," he announced, loosening his tie. "They're ready to move forward. The Stanton deal is as good as done. Morrison and Associates is going to make millions on this." I began collecting the empty glasses, my movements mechanical. "You did well tonight," Richard continued, pouring himself a nightcap. "Very professional. Patterson seemed quite impressed with you." There it was, the opening I needed. "He offered me a job," I said quietly. Richard laughed. "Of course he did. Patterson's always recruiting. It's how Morrison operates. Find good support staff and lock them into their ecosystem. Smart business. And if I wanted to take it? The laughter died. Richard turned to look at me, his expression hardening. Excuse me? If I wanted to take the job, I repeated, meeting his eyes, would you support me? For a moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Not concern for me, not love, but something darker. Possession. Rebecca, he said, using my name for the first time all evening. We've discussed this. You don't need to work. We're financially secure. Your place is here, managing our home, supporting my career. My place, I echoed. Yes, your place. He set down his glass, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. Look, I understand you get bored sometimes. Maybe we should look into some volunteer work for you, charity boards, that sort of thing. Something appropriate. Appropriate? Don't repeat everything I say, he snapped. You know what I mean. Something that fits with our lifestyle, our position. I'm a senior associate at Morrison & Associates now. We have a certain image to maintain. Senior associate. He'd been promoted 3 months ago, a promotion I'd later learned came right after Morrison closed a deal with a client they'd stolen from my firm using information Richard had provided. What if I told you I wanted more? I asked. More than this? He gestured around the penthouse. More than a luxury apartment, a platinum credit card, the ability to spend your days however you please. Rebecca, do you know how many women would kill for your life? My life, I said softly. Is that what this is? You're being dramatic, Richard dismissed. You've always had a flair for the dramatic. It's probably why you burned out at that firm you worked at before we met. Burned out. That was his version of events. Not that I'd strategically repositioned myself. Not that I'd been building something larger. Burned out. Richard, I said carefully, do you remember the name of the firm I worked at? He paused, his drink halfway to his lips. Of course, it was, what was it? Hartley something. Hartley, Chen and Bradford. Right. Small firm. You were an associate there or something. Small firm. The third largest litigation firm in the state. An associate. When I'd been a junior partner heading toward full partnership. And you know what I did there? Corporate law, I think. He was already losing interest, checking his phone. Does it matter? That's all behind you now. Everything was behind me now. My career, my identity, my truth. All buried beneath Richard's need to feel superior. His inability to accept that the woman he'd married was more successful, more powerful, more respected than he would ever be. I walked to the window, looking out over the city lights. Somewhere out there, in a high-rise office building, my name was on a door. Rebecca Bradford, senior partner. Tomorrow morning, that name would be on a motion to intervene in the Stanton merger. That name would be on the brief that would expose Morrison & Associates' tactics. That name would be associated with the case that would make or break several careers, including Richard's. I'm going to bed, I announced. Fine, Richard muttered, not looking up from his phone. Don't forget to clean up the kitchen first. I stood there for a long moment, looking at this man I'd married, this man I'd loved, this man who'd spent 3 years systematically destroying everything I was. Of course, I said. I'll take care of it. But I wasn't talking about the kitchen. In my private study, a room Richard never entered because he assumed it was just my hobby space, I logged into the secure server. Margaret and David were both online, waiting. It's time, I typed. Margaret's response was immediate. Are you absolutely certain? This will end your marriage. I thought about Richard out there, scrolling through his phone, probably texting his colleagues about his successful evening. I thought about the way he'd introduced me to his clients. I thought about the years of diminishment, of erasure, of watching my identity dissolve. "My marriage ended tonight," I typed back. I just didn't realize it until now. "Tomorrow, we move forward with the Gemtech strategy, and we add one more element." "What element?" David asked. I pulled up the files our investigators had compiled. Every piece of information Richard had stolen, every client conversation he'd compromised, every ethical boundary he'd crossed. "We file a complaint with the state bar. Richard Bradford has been using privileged spousal communications to benefit his firm. He's been violating attorney-client privilege, professional ethics, and a dozen other regulations. Morrison and Associates has been receiving and acting on information they knew was improperly obtained." The chat fell silent for a moment. Then Margaret. "Rebecca, that will destroy him. His career will be over." "He destroyed me first," I typed. "Or at least he tried to. Tomorrow he learns that you can't erase someone who was never really gone." David's message appeared. "The board meeting is at 9. We'll need you there in person. No more proxies, no more hiding. Are you ready for that?" Was I ready? Ready to step back into my life, to reclaim my name, to face Richard's reaction when he learned the truth? "I'll be there," I confirmed. "And David, call Patterson. Tell him we're prepared to offer him a position at our firm. I think he'll be receptive." "Poaching Morrison's client." "Not poaching, rescuing. There's a difference." I logged off and sat in the darkness of my study, listening to Richard move around the living room. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, the carefully constructed facade would crumble. Tomorrow, my husband would learn that the woman he'd introduced as Maria was actually Rebecca Bradford, one of the most powerful attorneys in the state. And the woman he'd spent 3 years trying to erase was about to erase him right back. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "This is Patterson. I don't know who you really are, but I know you're not just staff. If you need anything, I meant what I said. Call me." I smiled in the darkness. Patterson had seen through Richard's charade in a single evening. He'd recognized something Richard had failed to see in 3 years of marriage, that you can't diminish someone's inherent worth by pretending it doesn't exist. Tomorrow morning, the legal world would be reminded of exactly who Rebecca Bradford was, and Richard would learn that the woman he'd introduced as the maid had been running the house the entire time. I just hadn't been talking about our penthouse. The city lights blurred as my eyes filled with tears. Not tears of sadness, but of rage, of resolution, of righteous fury. I'd given Richard every opportunity to see me, to respect me, to love me for who I truly was. He'd chosen instead to remake me into something smaller, something controllable, something that wouldn't threaten his fragile ego. Tomorrow, he would learn the cost of that choice. I pulled up the calendar on my phone. The Stanton merger board meeting was at 9. The state bar complaint would be filed at 9:30. By 10, the legal community would be buzzing with news of Morrison and Associates' ethical violations. By 11, Richard would know his wife was the architect of his destruction. By noon, he would finally understand who he'd been married to all along. The penthouse was silent now. Richard had gone to bed, probably dreaming of his successful evening, his impressed clients, his rising star at Morrison and Associates. He had no idea that while he slept, his world was being systematically dismantled by the woman he'd introduced as Maria. I returned to the kitchen, not to clean as he'd ordered, but to pour myself a glass of wine. Tomorrow would be long, brutal, devastating. But tonight, I would allow myself this moment of quiet certainty, this moment of knowing that justice, however delayed, was finally coming. The champagne flutes still sat on the counter, still bearing the lipstick marks and fingerprints of Richard's colleagues. Men who had looked through me, who had treated me as invisible, who had discussed their illegal strategies in front of me because they assumed I was too insignificant to matter. They had made the same mistake Richard had, assuming that silence meant submission, that stillness meant weakness, that invisibility meant powerlessness. Tomorrow, they would all learn differently. I raised my glass to my reflection in the darkened window, a ghost of a woman who had spent 3 years being erased, who had allowed herself to be diminished, who had played the part her husband had assigned her. Tomorrow, that ghost would become solid again. Tomorrow, Rebecca Bradford would step back into the light, and Richard's world would burn. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mahogany conference table as I took my seat at the head of the room. 23 faces stared back at me, the full board of Hartley, Chen, and Bradford, plus representatives from Gemtech Industries and one unexpected guest, Patterson. He'd arrived an hour early, requesting an emergency meeting. What he'd told me had changed everything. "Rebecca," Margaret whispered, leaning close. "Are you sure you want him here for this?" I glanced at Richard, who sat in the corner with the other Morrison and Associates representatives, his face pale. He'd been stunned when I'd walked into the room 45 minutes ago, dressed in my signature navy suit, my hair pulled back in the professional style I'd abandoned 3 years ago. He still hadn't spoken to me, hadn't approached me. He just sat there, his world already crumbling, waiting for the final blow. "I'm sure," I said. Patterson had revealed something crucial. Morrison and Associates hadn't just been using Richard's stolen information. They'd known exactly who I was from the beginning. They'd orchestrated Richard's interest in me, encouraged the relationship, pushed for the marriage. I wasn't just a source of information. I was their long-term strategy to infiltrate and eventually absorb my firm. Richard had been a pawn too, just a more willing one. "Let's begin," I announced, my voice steady. "For those who don't know me, I'm Rebecca Bradford, senior partner and founding member of this firm." Murmurs rippled through the Gemtech representatives. They'd been told they were meeting with the reclusive Bradford, but seeing me in person was clearly different than the encrypted video calls they were accustomed to. "Ms. Bradford," Richard's voice cracked across the room. He stood, his hands trembling. "What is this? What are you doing here?" "I'm conducting a board meeting, Richard." "What are you doing here?" I kept my voice neutral, professional. "You can't be." He looked wildly around the room. "This is impossible. Your wife," I finished. "Yes. I'm also the attorney who's about to destroy the case you've been building for the past 6 months. I nodded to David, who activated the presentation screen. Documents filled the display. The information Richard had stolen, the conversations he'd compromised, the ethical violations Morrison and Associates had committed. Richard Bradford has spent our marriage systematically stealing privileged information from this firm, I continued. He's passed that information to Morrison and Associates, who have used it to undermine our clients, steal our strategies, and position themselves for the Stanton merger. "That's not..." Richard started. "We have recordings," I cut him off. "We have bank records. We have emails. We have testimony from 3 Morrison partners who've agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency." Richard collapsed back into his chair. Around him, his colleagues from Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "But here's what you didn't know, Richard," I continued, standing now. Morrison knew who I was. They targeted me through you. They encouraged you to pursue me, to marry me, to isolate me from my firm. You thought you were the clever one, mining your wife for information. You were just their tool. I watched the realization dawn on his face. The betrayal, the humiliation. Everything he'd done to me reflected back at him. Mr. Patterson, I said, turning to the silver-haired attorney, would you like to explain your role in this? Patterson stood, his expression grave. 6 months ago, I was approached by Morrison's senior partners. They asked me to help facilitate what they called market consolidation. I didn't realize until last night that this meant destroying Hartley, Chen, and Bradford through corporate espionage. He pulled out a folder, placing it on the table. These documents show Morrison's full strategy. They plan to use Richard's information to systematically undermine HC&B's client base, then position themselves for a hostile acquisition. The Stanton merger was meant to give them the capital and leverage to make their move. Why are you telling us this? Richard demanded, his voice desperate. You're Morrison's client. I was, Patterson corrected. Until last night, when I realized what kind of firm I'd been working with. And when I met your wife properly, not as Maria the Maid, but as the attorney whose reputation I've respected for years. The room fell silent. I let the weight of it settle before continuing. The State Bar has been notified, I said. Morrison and Associates will face sanctions. Richard, you'll be disbarred. The Stanton merger will not proceed, not the way you planned it. Gemtech has agreed to partner with us instead, and we'll be conducting a full ethical review of the proposed merger terms. Rebecca, please. Richard stood again, his voice breaking. This will destroy me. Everything I've worked for. Everything. You worked for? I felt the rage I'd suppressed for 3 years finally surface. You spent our marriage trying to destroy everything I worked for. You introduced me as your maid, Richard, to your colleagues, in my own home. You erased my identity, my career, my accomplishments. You made me invisible. I didn't know. You didn't want to know. My voice echoed through the conference room. You couldn't handle being married to someone more successful than you, so you convinced yourself I was nothing. You convinced yourself that my career had been small, insignificant, forgettable. You rewrote our history to make yourself feel bigger. I loved you, he whispered. You loved the idea of me, I corrected. You loved having a beautiful wife who stayed home, who played hostess, who made you look good. You never loved me. You didn't even know me. I turned back to the board. Morrison and Associates will be given the option to cooperate fully with the State Bar investigation or face criminal charges for corporate espionage. Richard will surrender his license voluntarily or will pursue disbarment proceedings. And the merger? Asked one of the Gemtech representatives. We'll proceed ethically, I assured him. Patterson has agreed to join our firm as a partner. He'll lead the restructured merger team. We'll be conducting full environmental reviews, addressing the violations Morrison tried to hide, and ensuring this merger benefits all stakeholders, not just the attorney's billing hours. Patterson nodded. It's the right thing to do. I should have questioned Morrison's tactics months ago. What about us? Richard asked quietly. What about our marriage? I looked at him, really looked at him. For the first time in months. The man I'd loved was gone, if he'd ever really existed. In his place was someone I didn't recognize, a man who'd been used by his firm, who'd used me in turn, who'd lost himself in the desperate pursuit of significance. Our marriage ended the moment you introduced me as Maria, I said. Divorce papers will be filed this afternoon. The prenup you signed is ironclad. You'll leave with exactly what you brought into this relationship. Nothing. The penthouse is mine. It's always been mine. The furniture, the art, the car you drive, all mine. You've been living in my world, Richard, playing with my toys. Now playtime is over." He stood there broken as the full weight of his situation crashed over him. No career, no marriage, no home. Everything he'd thought he'd built revealed as borrowed, stolen, temporary. "I think we're done here," Margaret said gently. "Richard, Mr. DeLuca, Mr. Wolfe, you'll need to leave. Our security team will escort you out." As they filed out, Richard paused at the door. "I'm sorry," he said, not looking at me. "For all of it." "So am I," I replied. "I'm sorry I didn't trust myself enough to be honest with you from the beginning. I'm sorry I let you make me small. I'm sorry I wasted 3 years trying to fit into the role you assigned me." He left without another word. The board meeting continued for another 2 hours. We restructured the merger strategy, brought Patterson officially into the firm, and laid out our cooperation plan with the state bar. By the time we finished, the legal community was already buzzing with news. "Rebecca," Patterson approached me as people filed out. "Thank you for giving me a chance to make this right." "You saw me," I said simply. "Last night, when everyone else looked through me, you actually saw me. That matters." "For what it's worth," he said, "I think you're going to be just fine. Better than fine." He was right. 2 weeks later, the state bar suspended Morrison and Associates' license pending investigation. Richard surrendered his law license voluntarily, avoiding the public spectacle of disbarment. The divorce was finalized in record time. Richard didn't contest anything. The Stanton Gemtech merger proceeded under our guidance, with full environmental reviews and fair dealing on all sides. Patterson proved to be an excellent addition to our firm, bringing his integrity and experience to our team. As for me, I stopped hiding. I attended legal conferences under my own name. I took on high-profile cases. I rebuilt the public profile I'd abandoned 3 years ago. One evening, 6 months after that fateful board meeting, I stood in my penthouse, my home, undeniably mine, looking out over the city. The space felt different now, lighter, mine. My phone buzzed. A message from Margaret. Saw the journal announcement. "Congratulations on the appointment to the State Bar Ethics Committee. Well deserved." I smiled. The Ethics Committee position would let me help prevent what had happened to me from happening to others. It was a chance to make the system better, fairer, more just. There was another message, this one from an unknown number. "Saw you on the news. You look happy. You look like yourself. Good for you. R. Richard." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. He didn't deserve my words, my time, my energy. He'd taken enough from me. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine. Not champagne this time, but a rich red that I'd been saving for a special occasion. Tonight felt special. Not because of any external achievement, but because I finally felt whole again. The woman Richard had tried to erase was back. The woman his colleagues had dismissed as the Maid was now one of the most respected attorneys in the state. The woman who'd served drinks while they plotted their illegal merger was now sitting on the ethics committee that would hold them accountable. I raised my glass to my reflection in the window. No longer a ghost, no longer invisible, no longer playing a role someone else had assigned me. Just Rebecca Bradford, attorney, partner, survivor, and finally, completely, myself. The city lights sparkled below, and somewhere out there, other people were, fighting their own battles for recognition, for dignity, for the right to be seen as they truly were. Tomorrow, I would continue fighting those battles with them, using my position and my voice to make things better. But tonight, I would simply stand in my home, in my life, in my truth, and celebrate the fact that you can erase someone's name, you can dismiss their accomplishments, you can try to make them invisible, but you cannot erase who they fundamentally are. That truth survives everything, even 3 years of marriage to someone who couldn't see it. I took a sip of wine and smiled. I was home. Finally, truly home. Not in the penthouse, though that was nice, but in myself. And no one could take that away from me ever again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.